Morning, everybody. Welcome to Sweet Jesus, because ice cream is sweet, but Jesus is sweeter. But because it's morning, had a later night last night, long day, and I had some time this morning, so I thought I would do a morning edition of Sweet Jesus. But I just couldn't find a way to do ice cream this early. So instead, got some honey and some tea, and gonna add that to the tea and say instead that honey is sweet, but Jesus is sweeter. How about that? You can still participate, enjoy, watch later with a bowl of ice cream or some pie or cookies or something like that. I can't do that. Not this early. I love ice cream too, but I don't think my stomach can handle it. So there we go. Got an exciting chapter we're looking at here today. It's the problem of sin. And it's really probably one of the most important things for us to grasp as Christians, because I think it's going to be the most effective way to speak to our culture today. As we'll see as we go through the chapter here, most people kind of feel like they're pretty decent people, and they don't respond very well to the old method, the more traditional method of talking about sin, more like a courtroom, and here's all these things you've done wrong, and there's justice, and it's not that that's not true, but it's that it doesn't resonate the same way with people in 21st century America, in the modern Western culture. But there are some other ways that the Bible talks about sin. Sin is far more than just the things that we do wrong that upset God. Okay, that actually those things that we do that are wrong, that upset God, are actually the result of a more fundamental understanding of what sin really is and how it operates in our hearts, our minds, and our lives. And like I said, it's going to be way more effective in helping speak to people outside the faith. And frankly, just on a personal note, what I've found personally is that as I have recognized sin in this way that we're going to talk about in my own life and in my own heart, it's actually helped me find more effective ways of doing battle against sin, if that makes sense. So not that I'm less of a sinner necessarily, but that when I sin, or when my life becomes complicated or difficult or challenging, when I begin to get angry or worry or anxious or fearful, I actually have a far better understanding of how to deal with it. And that's actually what I think we may not get totally clearly out of the chapter itself, but I hope that it sparks something in you to begin that process and dig deeper into these ideas to strengthen your life of faith. Now, if you're not a Christian, you're taking a look at this, I hope you'll see that sort of the way that people have understood Christians is in part probably because a lot of Christians just don't understand their faith as well as they should. And there are maybe some caricatures out there, but the Bible, Christianity, Christian doctrine is so much more. There's a much fuller understanding there than what you probably think. So I encourage you to dig a little deeper too. But hey, let's get going here into chapter 10 the problem of sin. The opening quotes here are both from H.G. Wells, and they present a pretty stark contrast, both from the same person, 9 years apart. So in the first quote, he says, "Can we doubt that presently our race will more than realize our boldest imaginations, that it will achieve unity and peace, and that our children will live in a world made more splendid and lovely than any palace or garden that we know, going on from strength to strength in an ever-widening circle of achievement? What man has done, the little triumphs of his present state, form but the prelude to the things that man has yet to do." H.G. Wells, from A Short History of the World, 1937. Pretty optimistic, right? Now listen to what he says in 1946. "The cold-blooded massacres of the defenseless, the return of deliberate and organized torture, mental torment, and fear to a world from which such things had seemed well nigh banished, has come near to breaking my spirit altogether. Homo sapiens, as he has been pleased to call himself, is played out." And then the first sentence of the chapter: "It is hard to avoid the conclusion that there is something fundamentally wrong with the world." And this is right at the outset a far better understanding of sin than any of the things that we're doing. You know, a lot of Christians talking about things, morality, and all that kind of stuff. I'm not saying that those aren't true and that God is more excited about us being good than not being good, for our sake and for the sake of our neighbors. But sin is what is wrong with everything, and we are not in a place where we can just fix the world and put it back together. It's just not going to happen. This is in the 30s and 40s, and we've had more cycles like that, and in the past and since. I start out almost all of my funeral sermons with something like that. Something's wrong with the world. And we know at a funeral, we know something's wrong with the world because the person we know and love, sometimes a very good person, is dead. Something's wrong. No matter how good they are, no matter how much medical science advances, we are still putting people in boxes. Anyway, let's try and keep going with the chapter here. He says our biggest problem is sin, but the concept of sin is offensive or ludicrous to many. And it's often because we just don't understand sin in a more complete, full sense. So, sin and human hope. He starts out here with this story about a man who comes to him for pastoral counseling. He's kind of despondent because his wife has just left him. He's angry, guilty, despondent, all those things. And he said to this man, "What you need more than anything is hope." And the man agrees. And as gently as possible, I said that the good news was he was a sinner. Because he was a sinner, he wasn't simply the helpless victim of psychological drives or social systems. And when I first read that, I was kind of like, huh? And I got to say that I'm still not entirely clear on where he's going here at the outset. There's a quote here that I'll read from a Barbara Brown Taylor that I think helps get us closer. But this first section I did find it was a little weird. I'm not sure I fully grasped exactly why he's choosing this way to go about getting to where he wants to go. But I do agree with where he wants to go, and where he eventually ends up is fantastic. So just hang on. So he comes across a passage in a sermon by Barbara Brown Taylor much later, who said more eloquently what I tried to say that day. And here's what she says: neither the language of medicine nor of law is adequate substitute for the language of sin. Contrary to the medical model, we are not entirely at the mercy of our maladies. The choice is to enter into the process of repentance. Contrary to the legal model, the essence of sin is not primarily the violation of laws, but a wrecked relationship with God, one another, and the whole created order. All sins are attempts to fill voids, wrote Simone Weil. Because we cannot stand the God-shaped hole inside of us, we try stuffing it full of all sorts of things, but only God may fill it. So I think what he was trying to say, and where this quote from Barbara Brown Taylor is going, of course, is it's getting to idolatry. I'm just not sure I would have said, hey, here's the good news, you're a sinner. I guess is what I was getting at. He tells another story. There's a guy, Andrew Del Blanco, a professor at Columbia University, who was doing research, and he went to all these Alcoholics Anonymous meetings to do research on Alcoholics Anonymous, AA. And one Saturday morning, he's in New York City church basement. He's listening to this guy who looks great. He's talking about his problems. And as he talked, he projected a persona that was essentially flawless. He was the victim of the hurts of countless other people. All his mistakes were due to the injustice and betrayals of others. He spoke of how he was going to avenge himself on all who had wronged him. His every gesture gave the impression of grievously wounded pride. It was clear that the young man was trapped in his need to justify himself, and that things could only get worse and worse in his life until he recognized this. While he was speaking, a black man in his 40s, in dreadlocks and dark shades, leaned over to this professor, Andrew Del Blanco, and said, I used to feel that way too before I achieved low self-esteem. And now here's a lengthier quote from Del Blanco. This was more than a good line. For me, it was the moment I understood in a new way the religion I had claimed to know something about. As the speaker bombarded us with phrases like, got to take control of my life, and I've got to really believe in myself, the man beside me took refuge in the old Calvinist doctrine that pride is the enemy of hope. What he meant by his joke about self-esteem was that he learned no one can save himself by dint of his own efforts. He thought the speaker was still lost in himself, but without knowing it. Now, of course, low self-esteem was not meant to mean the guy has to start hating himself. He meant that this guy was still lost in himself, and until he could admit that he was a very flawed human being, a sinner, he would never be liberated to see his own flaws in their true light, to forgive those who had wronged him, or to humbly seek and receive forgiveness from others. The Christian doctrine of sin, properly understood, can be a great resource for human hope. But what is that doctrine? And that's what he's going to start to unpack. But you see already in real life situations and circumstances that this understanding of sin is going to be something that applies so much more powerfully. And if you've ever had an experience with anyone that suffers from addiction of any kind, If you've ever had connections with AA, or just know a little bit about it, one of the biggest aspects of the whole program and the success that it has with a variety of people is usually it's built entirely upon basically giving up, surrendering, recognizing that you on your own cannot do it. You cannot do it on your own. I mean, that's a fundamental part uh, of what the path to recovery looks like. And that's actually a helpful way of thinking about sin, that sin, ultimately, we have to understand that we are so broken, that it's so fundamentally a part of our humanity, that we can't just go around fixing it by being good. So that's where the whole, like, sin is disobeying God, so stop disobeying God and you won't sin. Like, it's just not a full enough understanding to help us really get at the root causes and the issues with sin. So, all right, now he goes on to quote Kierkegaard, Danish philosopher, I believe also a Lutheran. Yay, go Lutherans. He defines sin in a way that is rooted in the Bible, but also accessible to contemporary people. He says, sin is in despair, not wanting to be oneself before God, and faith is that the self, in being itself and wanting to be itself, is grounded transparently in God. And then Keller tries to explain this a little bit for us. Sin is the despairing refusal to find your deepest identity in your relationship and service to God. Sin is seeking to become oneself or to get an identity apart from Him. So this is essentially, again, we're getting to the roots of idolatry, or a breaking of the first commandment. Everyone gets their identity from something, from somewhere. Kierkegaard asserts that human beings were made not only to believe in God in some general way, right? So it's not just head knowledge, but to love Him supremely, to center their lives on Him above anything else, and build their very identities on Him. Anything other than this is sin. And if you are familiar with the Old and New Testaments, what Jesus calls the greatest commandment, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And all the others flow out of that. Everything else. It all starts and ends with that. And how we, to get at our issues with some of the other commandments, is actually really all about the first commandment. It's really all about that greatest commandment. You shall have no other gods. That's ultimately the foundation of everything else that goes wrong in the world, and what's wrong with us, and why we struggle and suffer so much sometimes. Not that there aren't outside influences and forces, but that this is still at the heart of what makes us so miserable sometimes. Most people think of sin primarily as breaking divine rules. The very first commandment is at the heart of everything. So, according to the Bible, the primary way to define sin is not just the doing of bad things, but the making of good things into ultimate things. Seeking a sense of self by making something else more central to your significance, purpose, and happiness than your relationship to God. He's going to quote Rocky here and Chariots of Fire. Rocky, in the movie, his girlfriend asks him why it's so important for him to go the distance in this boxing match. And he replies, "Then I'll know I'm not a bum." Wow. Chariots of Fire. One of the main characters explains why he works so hard at running the 100-yard dash for the Olympics. He says that when each race begins, I have 10 lonely seconds to justify my existence. Both of these men look to athletic achievement as the defining force that gave meaning to their lives. A little bit further down, he's quoting an author, the Pulitzer Prize winning author for the book The Denial of Death. He says, our need for worth is so powerful that when whatever we base our identity and value on, we essentially deify. We will look to it with all the passion and intensity of worship and devotion, even if we think of ourselves as highly irreligious. And he says the self-glorification that modern man needed in his innermost nature, he now looked for in the love partner. The love partner becomes the divine ideal within which to fulfill one's life. Spiritual and moral needs now become focused on one individual. Becker is not saying that everyone looks to romance and love for a sense of self. Many look not to romance, but rather to work and career for cosmic significance. Sometimes, this is the author Becker being quoted again, sometimes his work has to carry the burden of justifying him. What does justifying mean? He lives the fantasy of the control of life and death, of destiny. But all this only sets the stage for continual disappointment. No human relationship can bear this burden of godhood. If your partner is your all, then any shortcoming in him becomes a major threat to you. What is it that we want when we elevate the love partner to this position? We want to be rid of our feeling of nothingness, to know our existence has not been in vain. We want redemption, nothing less. Needless to say, humans cannot give this. We are all trying to justify our lives, to justify our worth, our significance. We're all struggling to find some sense of identity. Our culture today is very different from cultures of the past. In the past, culture was much more communal. So in other words, you, and this is still the case in a lot of cultures around the world, but you are more likely to get your identity from the world around you, from the community, from your family. They would tell you who you were. There were a lot of bad things associated with that, of course. I'm not saying that we need to go back to that, but now, our modern 21st century American culture, I mean, you are the master of your own destiny. You are literally supposed to figure out your own identity. What do you want to be when you grow up? I mean, we're putting on young children this burden of trying to figure out their identity. And so now we have, our culture actually facilitates this. It's saying, look for something that you can use to find a sense of identity, of who you are and who you're going to be and who you're going to become. That's not the case for a large part of human history and other cultures around the world. It's not just like we just decide. We're in the most independent, self-determining culture that the world has ever seen. And so idolatry is really the approach, because what we're doing is we wind up, we're trying to figure out a way to prove ourselves to someone. I mean, this is back to a previous chapter, right? Like, we all have this sense that we're trying to live up to something, and doesn't that point to a God, right? That's just kind of rehashing a little bit, making a connection there. But people that strive the hardest for things are usually trying to build an identity off of that thing. And that doesn't mean like the people that are rich and famous. It means all of us. But When you're consumed with your kids being perfect, you start to get really anxious and angry and fearful when it seems like there's a threat to that. If it's your career, that's going to make a mess of you if your career is who you are, if it's your identity. When those things are threatened, that's usually when all the other commandments get broken, because we're trying to protect our God. And Christians, we are not immune from this. Just because we go to church, just because we say Jesus is my Lord and Savior, doesn't mean that's actually how we behave. It doesn't mean that that's actually what we really think deep down internally. So, there's a point probably about 5 years ago where I realized that kind of like that guy in the AA meeting, up until then, I was like, why is all this stuff happening to me, right? And finally I realized that, well, yeah, it is, and it's not good, and shame on these folks that had been, kind of making my life a little miserable. But the reason it bothered me was because I didn't really believe that Jesus was the head of the church. I believed I was the head of the church. I didn't trust Jesus to take care of me or to work things out for the good of his people and for my good. I believed that if the church was successful, I was successful. If the church wasn't successful, I was nothing. I was meaningless. And that acknowledgement was transformative. It was in a moment. It was like the weight of my life was just, I mean, there was nothing. Matthew 11, Jesus says, come to me, all you who are weary, and I will give you rest. For my yoke is easy. Take my yoke upon you, for my yoke is easy and light. I don't think I had ever, up until that point, I must have been 30 something, 32, 33. I don't think I'd ever truly experienced that until that moment, where I stopped caring what other people thought. I stopped building my identity off of my success as a pastor. I actually trusted Jesus at his word that he was the head of the church, and that if he wanted things to go a certain way, and I don't know that this was true, although maybe it was. If he wanted something to go poorly, who was I to stand in the way? I mean, that's like getting in front of a train. Bible passage for this Sunday is from Luke 21. I'm preaching, and Jesus is with his disciples, and there are people, they start asking him, hey, look at this beautiful temple. And then Jesus says, oh, well, guess what? All these stones, there will not be left one stone upon another until they're all taken down. It's all coming down. And life is not always easy. And me trying to stop all of those things and fix all of those things, well, it was just a demonstration of idolatry. That's basically what it was. There is another incident probably a year ago or so where I was on vacation, and shortly after that vacation, I had a whole bunch of things that I needed to get done that were coming up, big things. And I was thinking, just sitting around doing nothing. It was also a staycation, so I wound up actually not traveling. So I was at home, kind of made it hard. I'm thinking, oh, well, I could just spend a little time doing this. I could spend a little time just doing that. And I realized that I was building my identity again off of my achievements, off of what other people thought, off of my success as a pastor, instead of just saying, God says to rest. He says to be still and know that I am God, that He's going to take care of it. And once I had that, it was, again, another one of those moments. It wasn't as significant as the first one about 5 years ago, but it was like, oh, wow, I don't have to worry about this. God's got it. He's going to take control of it. And actually, the Sabbath and rest and all these other things is an intentional way of us saying, an actual practical way of demonstrating faith. And I said, well, how can I be a pastor if I don't have faith? I'm going to rest. So just some illustrations, some personal illustrations of how I've seen idolatry in my own life. I've seen it in raising my kids too, sometimes when I'm most frustrated with them. And it's actually been a while since that's happened, where it's gotten really, really bad, the frustration and anger and all that kind of stuff. It's been a really long time since it's been bad, because I realized that, well, I was worried about what people thought of me based on how I raised my kids. I was trying to be a perfect dad. I was trying to be a perfect parent. That I was making a good thing an ultimate thing, and I was actually not being a good dad. so the more I recognized idolatry in that sphere, that realm, the freer I became. I like to think it's working better with my kids. Only time will tell that for sure, but certainly it feels a lot better. Anyway, all right. All right, so this is exactly Kierkegaard's point. Every person must find some way to justify their existence and to stave off the universal fear that they are a bum. In more traditional cultures, the sense of worth and identity comes from fulfilling duties to family and giving service to society. In our contemporary individualistic culture, we tend to look to our achievements, our social status, our talents, or our love relationships. There are an infinite variety of identity bases. Some get their sense of self from gaining and wielding power, others from human approval, others from self-discipline and control, but everyone is building their identity on something. So there you go. Now, defining sin this way, we can see several ways that sin destroys us personally. Identity apart from God is inherently unstable. Without God, our sense of self-worth may seem solid on the surface, but it never is. It can desert you in a moment. For example, if I build my identity on being a good parent, I have no true self. I am just a parent, nothing more. If something goes wrong with my children or my parenting, there is no me left. Theologian Thomas Oden writes, suppose my God is sex, or my physical health, or the Democratic Party. If I experience any of these under genuine threat, then I feel myself shaken to the depths. Guilt becomes neurotically intensified to the degree that I have idolized finite values. Suppose I value my ability to teach and communicate clearly. If clear communication has become an absolute value for me, a center of value that makes all my other values valuable, then if I fail in teaching well, I am stricken with neurotic guilt. Bitterness becomes neurotically intensified when someone or something stands between me and something that is my ultimate value. So everything that we will build our life on that is not God ultimately will fail us. And when it does, as I tried to share a little bit, it shakes you to the core. And if you don't know what your idols are, that's how you can tell. When you are shaken to the core. When the anxiety reaches a level that's unreasonable. when something devastates you that doesn't necessarily devastate everyone else, that's how you know. Um, if anything threatens your identity, you will not just be anxious, but paralyzed with fear. If you lose your identity through the failings of someone else, you will not just be resentful, but locked into bitterness. If you lose it through your own failings, you will hate or despise yourself as a failure as long as you live. Only if your identity is built on God and His love, says Kierkegaard, can you have a self that can venture anything, face anything. One of the reasons I am doing this morning was I was in our confirmation class last night, and they were actually talking about idolatry, so kind of timely. And I shared with them, I forget, I may have mentioned this in a video previously, but there's a song, Need to Breathe is a band. They're Christians. They're not a Christian band necessarily, but they have a lot of Christian-centered or God-centered songs. Not all of them, but a lot of them. And one of the songs is called Hard Love, and I believe it's the bridge in the song goes something like this. When the wolves come and hunt me down, I will face them all and stand my ground, because there's a fire burning in me, and they will see my strength in this love I've found. Christians, I think one of our biggest challenges is people don't see that in us often enough. They often see us shaken by things as much or worse than they are. And that's not good. But that song helps illustrate the potential for us continuing down this path of repentance, continually repenting of our idols, recognizing them, acknowledging them, and then doing what we can to reorder our priorities, reorder our loves in such a way that we love God more than we love our career or our kids or our spouse or money or status or anything. I think that's what people are actually looking for. And until we can show them that, I'm not sure they're going to have as much interest in what we say we have to offer. What we do say we have to offer is everything we say it is. But far too often it's not obvious in our lives. And in part that's because of our pastors, right? Like I just told you, I'm a pastor, and like there have been moments in my own life where I had to go, oh my goodness, like this is idolatry. Like I don't actually have faith in Jesus. Like I say I have faith in Jesus. I believe this is true, but I don't actually have faith. Look at what I'm doing. Look at how anxious I am. Look at I can't rest. I can't take a vacation. So something to think about. There's no way to avoid this insecurity outside of God. Even if you say, I will not build my happiness or significance on anyone or thing, you will actually be building your identity on your personal freedom and independence. If anything threatens that, you will again be without a self, right? So like you can say, I'm not going to build my identity on anything, but actually then you're building your identity on something, on independence, on your ability to not be shaken by anyone or anything, and ultimately we are all shaken by something. He also says an identity not based on God also leads inevitably to deep forms of addiction. When we turn good things into ultimate things, we are, as it were, spiritually addicted. If we take our meaning in life from our family, our work, a cause, or some achievement other than God, they enslave us. We have to have them. St. Augustine said that our loves are not rightly ordered. He famously said to God, "Our hearts are restless until they find their rest in Thee." If we try to find our ultimate rest in anything else, our hearts become dislocated, out of joint. The good things that enslave us are good things that deserve to be loved. But when our heart loves become inordinate, then we fall into patterns of life that are not unlike substance addiction. As in all addiction, we are in denial about the degree to which we are controlled by our God substitutes. And inordinate love creates inordinate, uncontrollable anguish if anything goes wrong with the object of our greatest hopes. Addiction is one way that is much more helpful for understanding sin in a broader way, understanding sin, right? That we love things that are not bad things, but we love them more than we love God. And because we love them more than we love God, we do all kinds of things to protect them. And that's not helpful. And ultimately, they all fall apart, and we're going to be devastated, and nothing can do for us what God can do for us. He goes on here, and he's telling a story about how he was counseling two different women, both married, both had husbands who were poor fathers, both now had teenage sons who were beginning to get into trouble in school with the law. Both were angry at their husbands. He talked with them about the problems of unresolved bitterness and the importance of forgiveness. Both women agreed and sought to forgive. However, the woman who had the worst husband and who was the least religious was able to forgive. The other woman was not. This puzzled me for months until one day the unforgiving woman blurted out, "Well, if my son goes down the drain, then my whole life will have been a failure." She had centered her life on her son's happiness and success. That was why she couldn't forgive. You really got to get this book. You got to read this. You got to highlight it. You got to mark it up. There's just so much good stuff here. And this is just a wonderful example. I mean, not only of idolatry, but also how the least religious woman was able to forgive, and the most religious was not. The person who was in church, the person who demonstrated a faith in all kinds of other ways, but because something was going wrong with her son, she just couldn't get past it. She had to lay all the blame at the feet of her husband. And that's not to say that watching your kids suffer isn't hard. Watching your kids fail, of course it's hard. But God tells us that we are so much more than what we do. In fact, what we do or don't do never changes His love for us. Our identity, when it's found in God, in Christ, we see a God that will do anything, will give up everything for us. And He loves us. He forgives us. He desperately wants us. He just wants us. Yes, He wants us to do things. Yes, He wants us, but all of the things that we're doing wrong and that we're doing to disobey Him are actually things that we're doing to disobey Him because we don't love Him. We are disconnected from Him. We are not dwelling with Him or He with us in the way that He had intended from the beginning. Um, you don't need to be the perfect parent. You don't need to be the perfect husband. You don't need to be the perfect author or lawyer or doctor or, right? I mean, the whole world could hate your guts. It doesn't matter, because the only person that does matter um, loves you, and will always accept you and receive you. So he's got another story here. Daughter of a Lutheran pastor, left her Christian faith, moved to New York City, got into a life of club hopping and sexual obsession. She wrote some novels. She continued, however, to be extremely restless and unfulfilled. She quotes another author to summarize the main issue in her life. She says, "One has only the choice between God and idolatry. If one denies God, one is worshiping some things of this world in the belief that one sees them only as such. But in fact, though unknown to oneself, imagining the attributes of divinity in them." Right? So this is the inclination of the human heart. We will worship something. A life not centered on God, though, leads to emptiness. It not only hurts us if we, this is really important here. Building our lives on something besides God not only hurts us if we don't get the desires of our heart, but also if we do. For us, few of us get all of our wildest dreams fulfilled in life, and therefore it is easy to live in the illusion that if you were as successful, wealthy, popular, or beautiful as you wished, you'd finally be happy and at peace. That just isn't so. And in a Village Voice column, it's a publication in New York City, Cynthia Heimel thought back on all the people she knew in New York City before they became famous movie stars. One worked behind the makeup counter at Macy's, one worked selling tickets at movie theaters, and so on. When they became successful, every one of them became more angry, manic, unhappy, and unstable than they had been when they were working hard to get to the top. Why? Here's what Cynthia Heimel writes. That giant thing they were striving for, that fame thing that was going to make everything okay, that was going to make their lives bearable, that was going to fill them with happiness, had happened. And the next day they woke up and they were still them. The disillusionment turned them howling and insufferable. So one of the worst things you can get is everything you want. That's what these false gods do to us. That's what anything other than God does to us. The next section here goes into the social consequences of sin. There is so much here, and I think it's still building off some of the same things. It's essentially now talking about family and race and nation, and how if we build our identity off of those things, ultimately it leads to social chaos. Xenophobia, racism, nationalism, all those things are essentially based off of idolatry, and the idol, the god, is our family, our race, our nation, and so again, you see sin as the cause of all of these other sins. The sin that is that cause is really idolatry. Foucault is a philosopher, I believe, and this guy and others in our time have shown that it is far harder than we think to have a self-identity that doesn't lead to exclusion. The real culture war is taking place inside our own disordered hearts, racked by inordinate desires for things that control us, that lead us to feel superior and exclude those without them, and that fail to satisfy us even when we get them. So when we find a sense of identity that is outside of God, we are not just building on something that is going to collapse. We are building on something that will ultimately force us to exclude others. And he says that only if God is our ultimate good and life center will we find our heart drawn out, not only to people of all families, races, and classes, but to the whole world in general. If this is so fundamental to humanity, if you always use your terms, you really get upset when people don't. Right? I mean, it's just like good at spelling or grammar or something like that. Really bothers you when people aren't, and you get a sense of importance out of that, right? Like, look at me, I know how to place commas in ways that don't force us to eat grandma. You ever see that Facebook meme? And so when we build our lives on anything that's not God, we're honest, right? Well, we look down on people who aren't honest. We go to church, we look down on people who don't go to church. We take care of our children a particular way. We look down on others who don't take care of their children the same way we do, make the same parenting choices, right? Mom shaming is a thing. It is who human beings are, and it's never going to change, because that's what sin is. That's the root of sin in our hearts, idolatry. But it's certainly not going to change if we personally aren't rooting out the idols of our own hearts and finding our identity based in God. There's some C.S. Lewis quotes here. They're pretty good. He makes a good point that, when we come to Christ, we're not just asking him to take care of, like, here's some bad things that I want you to fix. Fix these areas of my life, make me more moral or something like that. No, he wants all of us. He wants us to give him even the good things that we do, or the things that seem innocent. He wants our whole self. And he gets to a point here. He says, the almost impossibly hard thing is to hand over your whole self to Christ. But it is far easier than what we are all trying to do instead. For what we are trying to do is remain what we call, quote, ourselves, our personal happiness centered on money or pleasure or ambition, and hoping, despite this, to behave honestly and chastely and humbly. And that is exactly what Christ warned us you cannot do. If I am a grass field, all the cutting will keep the grass less, but won't produce wheat. If I want wheat, I must be plowed up and resown. Oh man, I think I highlighted this whole page. Does that scare you? Does it sound stifling? Remember this: if you don't live for Jesus, you will live for something else. If you live for career and you don't do well, it may punish you all your life, and you will feel like a failure. If you live for your children and they don't turn out all right, you could be absolutely in torment because you feel worthless as a person. If Jesus is your center and Lord and you fail him, he will forgive you. Your career can't die for your sins. You might say, if I were a Christian, I'd be going around pursued by guilt all the time. But we all are being pursued by guilt because we must have an identity. And there must be some standard to live up to by which we get that identity. Whatever you base your life on, you have to live up to that. Jesus is the one Lord you can live for, who died for you, who breathed his last breath for you. Does that sound oppressive? You may say, I see that Christianity might be just the thing for people who have had collapses in their lives, but what if I don't fail in my career? And what if I have a great family? As Augustine said, if there is a God who created you, then the deepest chambers of your soul simply cannot be filled up. like anything less. That is how great the human soul is. If Jesus is the Creator Lord, then by definition, nothing could satisfy you like He can, even if you are successful. Even the most successful careers and families cannot give the significance, security, and affirmation that the author of glory and love can. Everybody has to live for something. Whatever that something is becomes Lord of your life, whether you think of it that way or not. Jesus is the only Lord who, if you receive Him, will fulfill you completely, and if you fail Him, will forgive you eternally. I think I highlighted that entire last page because I don't think I could say it better. So I hope you have found this helpful, thought-provoking, and challenging, whether a Christian, not a Christian, and that it causes you to spend some time thinking about the ways that you, because you have, just like I have, the ways that you have built your life on things that are unstable and that are ultimately unfulfilling. And I hope that it will give you reasons to think about building your identity on God, finding your true self in Christ. But that's it for now. Got some more things to do today, and we'll catch up with you maybe next week. See you. God bless. Bye.